Cloud-native architecture is driving 5G innovation for communication service providers by enabling them to more quickly and efficiently deliver new 5G services and applications. This approach allows CSPs to take advantage of the scalability, automation, and flexibility of cloud computing to build and deploy 5G networks and services. This allows CSPs to focus on delivering new services and experiences for their customers rather than managing complex network infrastructure. On this session are Vivek Chanda, Senior Vice President, Global Head, Telco Cloud at Rakuten Symphony, Kevin Schatzkamer, Digital Transformation Officer for Telecom at Google Cloud. Next to him is Ramanathan, Senior Director of Product Management at Ribbon Communications, and I'm Ron Westfall, Principal Analyst at Futura. And with this, let's get into it, gentlemen. First of all, I think many people would like to know, why is there a growing number of public cloud providers and hyperscalers offering cloud-native operations and Kubernetes? And Vivek, I think this is a good one for you to kick off with.
Thank you, Ron. I think there's mainly three things that are driving this movement. One of them comes from all the innovation that the cloud providers and the larger technology ecosystem has been putting into maturing the capability of the Kubernetes and the cloud-native environment. And it's now at a point where this can really be put into industrial scale use.
Yes.
So one is the technology curve is at a point where it's practically usable. The second is that the customers, especially the mobile network operators, they've understood how they can leverage containerization and cloud native to get the right balance between everything that they were able to get from the public cloud, but also have operational control and flexibility to a degree that was very, very difficult to achieve unless they did digital plumbing on their own. So now they want to leverage that capability. And last but not the least, the vendor ecosystem of network function providers and technology workloads, they started embracing containerization and cloud native as a way to provide a superior quality of service, faster deployment, agility, and start embracing the way actual softwareization of networks and network technologies can happen. So I think it's a confluence of all three that's driving this change.
Yeah, I'm seeing the same thing. I bet, Kevin, you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think first off, that's spot on. I love the 3 points. I think if we even flash back, right, the last decade has been a slow migration in this direction, right? I think in 2012-ish, when we talked about network function virtualization, telecom was a laggard in terms of their move towards software and virtualization, software-defined networking, all those trends we talked about. I think the last 3 years have really seen them move from laggard to leader in terms of rethinking how the entire software architecture gets built. And this is true across OSS and BSS, front office, back office, but the rate at which we're starting to see this evolution on the network side is really catching up to what OSS and BSS are and where we thought they would be. It's remarkable to watch.
I think that's welcomed by all. And Ram, I imagine you have
I just
some
want to
thoughts.
quickly add on, I think great points by Vivek and Kevin here. What I want to add on is, as carriers and enterprises are looking at the next evolution into cloud native, what better way to jumpstart that quickly with public cloud? Because public cloud has been doing this for a while with non-telco workloads. So this has been happening for a while. The operational toolkit is there, and the operational know-how is there. So if you want to jumpstart your journey, public cloud is a way to start. So.
Yeah, and Ram, I would even, I love your intersection there with the enterprise, because we're all focused on who the end consumers of this are, right? And I think the intersection of telecom from a connectivity perspective, moving more towards edge computing and service offerings, the intersection with public cloud, I think it's a confluence of realizing that it's not a whole bunch of piece parts, right? It's one continuum of a service offering.
Yeah, and I think that perfectly segues into the next topic that comes to mind. It's describing the commercial reasons, to adopt a cloud-native automation and orchestration platform. and in particular, when to use public cloud or private cloud. And Kevin, I think you're on a roll.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to continue with this. I don't think it's an either or, right?
Sure.
I think sometimes we've lived in that world in the telecom space for quite some time, right? Do I do this or do I do this? And the answer, I think, is this continuum continues to emerge, right? I think as long as we all focus on the demand profile of our enterprise customers, our consumer customers, what we'll realize is that they want simplicity of service offerings, right? And then when we think about how those service offerings are delivered from a developer community, they want simplified access to a set of APIs that allow them to drive the experience that they expect their end users will want. That's APIs from a performance perspective, that's an API from a latency perspective, it's an API from a data access perspective, data sovereignty perspective, security perspective. So when we talk about technologies like edge computing, we talk about technologies like network slicing, right? I think the intersection of how is a service delivered from a public cloud provider, but enabled through the telecom ecosystem all the way out to the end device. That's why we're starting to see not just the appearance of hyperscalers and public cloud providers in this space, but actually true partnerships between telecom and hyperscale.
Yeah, I've seen the same pattern. And Ram, imagine you're seeing the same kind of thing.
Absolutely right. I mean, Kevin had it spot on. It's about, on one side, it's about cost in terms of resource utilization, right? That's one. But I more look at the commercial profit on the profit side. In terms of the agility to launch new services, I think that's where the proof is, right? Proof is in the pudding. So cost, absolutely, we need to get there in terms of better resource utilizations. But with automation, observability, and the back-end infrastructure, the operational infrastructure, if that can be turned into profits in a much more quicker fashion, that's where the commercial benefits come from cloud native. And public cloud, as I said before, has done this with non-telco workloads. Just now we need to convert that to telco more real time. There are some challenges, don't get me wrong, but if we can get there, I think public clouds can really make this happen.
No doubt, Vivek, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, just one point I think that has also sort of helped accelerate the understanding of the value of orchestration and automation and what it actually can do. For example, in the era of COVID, when the ability for organizations to deploy their workforce became really limited, you couldn't do man and van. You couldn't have everybody going about their daily work the way they were used to for decades. Drove home the point that if we are able to harness technology and start doing a lot of stuff in an automated or a zero-touch fashion, and if we can reduce the amount of human contact that's needed to do things, one, it's good from a health and safety point of view, because it then, especially in the COVID kind of context, it allows you to have that level of social distancing, etc. But then there's cost economics, because what you're now being able to do is replicate best practices and processes from command and control with very little or zero human intervention, which reduces manual errors, etc. And from a telecoms perspective, if you come to 5G, the nature of the disaggregated network just defies the standard legacy operating model. You just can't scale it to meet what you're seeing in terms of deployments on the field for 5G. So there is a social imperative, I guess, but there's also operational benefit to be gained. And the nature of the disaggregation is also driving the need for these orchestration and automation technologies. I mean, we've demonstrated this at scale in Japan, in Rakuten Symphony, for example, where we are powering the end-to-end connectivity for Rakuten Mobile and a few other operators on those principles. And actually some of that, as you might be aware, happened during COVID in very complex geographies. And if it wasn't for automation, etc., it would be a very different outcome.
No doubt, and I think that's an inspiring example, and I think that cues us up to drill down. How is something like this possible? For example, how do advanced technologies like containers and microservices bring the capabilities like elasticity, flexible pricing, resiliency, and integrity into modern day architectural landscape? And Ram, I bet you have insight on this.
No, this is a very important question, Ron. In terms of, if I go back a few years, 5 years or so, when the industry started virtualizing applications, right, from hardware to virtualization, most of the vendor ecosystem, they brought their applications from the hardware world, virtualized it, plopped it on top of a hypervisor, virtualized it. It was a much easier game then, right? But as we look forward into containers, you cannot just take an application that's virtualized and put it into a container. You could do that, but most of the benefits in terms of service agility, automation, microservices, you cannot get the benefits of that. So really what the vendors need to do in this case is really design the application bottom up in a microserviced way and really choose their design principles in the right way, right? Because when you look at containers and cloud native benefits, it's about service agility. You want to launch new services. You should be able to upgrade those services fairly quickly in a modularized fashion. In cases where you don't want to upgrade the entire application, you should be able to upgrade just the microservices that you want to upgrade. That brings in service agility, right? And then automation is key, that kind of goes all across, and it's end-to-end automation, not just single device automation, end-to-end automation. That brings a lot of benefits on its own. So that needs to be thought out really carefully. And last but not the least is analytics and observability. So when you look at the old networks, where you had hundreds of devices, now you'll have thousands of containers or pods, right? So the scale of management becomes so much bigger. So analytics for troubleshooting and operations, observability framework, those need to be thought out really carefully along with automation. Once you have those pieces, microservices, automation, observability, then you have the entire end-to-end infrastructure. That'll then lead to the benefits of service agility and automation and resource utilization savings as well.
I doubt it. And Kevin?
Yeah, I think what I heard in there is kind of a shift from thinking vertical to thinking horizontal, right? And I think we live that vertical world in the hardware world, and when we first started to see the softwareization and virtualization of the network, what we saw come of that is first off virtual machines instead of containers, which meant a unique operating system for every single network function that got deployed, and every single vendor did something proprietary in the Linux kernel in order to get the optimization that they needed to move from a hardware world to a software world. And then we started to translate that into the containerized world, and all of a sudden proprietary work in Linux kernels doesn't bode well when you start to think about how you build an end-to-end architecture and how you simplify your operating systems and how you actually build multi-tenancy in the virtualization world. Right? It's not just single application running on single piece of hardware with single OS. It's lots of applications, lots of microservices. So I think starting to see this architecture appear horizontally rather than vertically siloed is a massive step forward. And I think that the benefit that's coming from that is that when operators take control and ownership of their own architectural destiny, what they're actually finding because of the simplification of the ecosystem of technology that sits around it is that they can actually piece part things from the open source communities and from different vendors and assemble them much more rapidly than they were before. It's still hard. Believe me, it's still going to be hard for some time to go, but it's not. I think we used to live in this world where we thought big open source projects needed to be consumed in their entirety instead of taking the best pieces that exist within open source from vendor communities and starting to put it together into a common architecture. I think that change is really accelerating the industry.
Right, Vivek, I bet you have some ideas.
Yeah, I think both Ram and Kevin have covered this really, really well. If I had to paraphrase the shift that Kevin spoke about in the last 5 years, I think from a philosophy point of view, the definition of infrastructure now explicitly includes software. It was always anything above the hardware level was the IT department or the software guys and the code that they write, and it was all about boxes and cables between the boxes. And now in the containerized world, there is a clear ability to say, well, if I design based on what my business needs are, translate that into a containerized application, I will assume that I can use any commodity hardware and get the job done. And that then starts dictating, because it's a very opinionated architecture, it starts dictating a contract, a discipline in which you start implementing stuff. So hopefully what we will see, and time will tell, whether the purity of the movement stays intact as vendors adopt and deploy their services in containers, because the last thing we would want to see is proprietary widgets being pulled in, because that then helps them get a little bit extra mileage out of a certain deployment, because then that's not really going to be true to a microservices, containerized, completely portable concept. That is the premise, one of the premises of cloud native as well. So I think the guys have covered it really well, but I think it's also about starting to say, let's not start designing everything from a boxes upward point of view. Let's start inverting the pyramid and say, what do I want business outcomes to look like, what my service level should be, what should my customer experience be, and what is the software and the workloads I need to do that. And now I can think about some infrastructure I need to run it, and it could be any infrastructure. So I think that's the big shift.
I think there's a customer centricity in what you just said there, right? I think we've always in the telco world separated how we build products for end customers, right? We've talked about network as a service. We've intuitively known that telco data is valuable to services. We've known we wanted to expose a set of APIs to be able to instantiate services on the network in new ways, but we didn't operate that way. Right? Telco operations team didn't use this abstraction layers and these APIs to drive their business. And the convergence of that is helping for a couple of different reasons. One, it's because the telco operations team are starting to think like developers, and it's helping them understand what their end users want. But more importantly, it's forcing a skill set shift in the telco operations world as well, right? You mentioned that infrastructure didn't include software anymore. Now you don't even need to understand infrastructure. Infrastructure is an API in and of itself. So now the conversation is, how do my internal operations team take advantage of infrastructure as an API or software as a service and really use the network in a way that that separates them from the low-level, granular, day-to-day management of individual nodes.
Yes, and I think this actually leads to, during these conversations, does it come up like, are there instances where cloud native may not be, the choice for the telco or enterprise? What is, I guess, your perspective on that, Kevin? You can cue that up.
So, as a cloud provider, we don't often encounter that type of scenario. I'll say that straightforwardly. But I think the answer is yes. Right, I think, and the one that jumps out at me is, maybe 10 years ago we talked about this conversation of software-defined networking, and we wouldn't see routers and switches anymore, and everything would be a cloud-native software function. But the reality is that there's still physical nodes that need to continue to exist, and the cost of virtualizing them and putting them on standard compute just doesn't make sense. Right, so I think we'll kind of continue to see the transport layer really be physically driven.
Sure.
That being said, I don't think there's necessarily a separation between how I orchestrate and whether the underlying function is physical or virtual. And I think that shift is really starting to come into play, where we can start to orchestrate at multiple layers across physical and virtual in new ways.
Ram, has that come up?
No, so a couple of things, right? One is where I see where it may not be that beneficial to convert to cloud native is some of the legacy networks, right? When I look at telco, there is obviously the TDM side, which people don't want to talk about, but there is still TDM out in the world, right? So when you look at the gateways and the TDM networks, and they're going to eventually go away. People have been saying that for years, but it's eventually going to go away in the next few years. So it doesn't bring out that many benefits in virtualizing that function or cloud native, nativizing that function. So that is one from a legacy perspective, but as we look forward into 5G and IMS and VoLTE and so forth, that makes perfect sense to take it to cloud native. But some of the legacy stuff, you may want to put that in an island, just let it live there and maybe at some point die, but that's something that may not get the benefits of cloud native anytime soon. The other aspect is, as Kevin was saying, it's not just about the technology, it's about the carriers and enterprises, the operations teams. They have to be in tune with what's going on, right? I mean, if you're part of the public cloud, you've been operating there for a while, you know what it is like to run a network or run an application in a cloud-native architecture. But if you're just getting there, there are multiple things, right, from people, from personnel level. You need to upskill your employees to think CI/CD, to think DevOps and so on, right? And then the actual inner workings of how do you do this end-to-end, how do you do upgrades, how do you do automation, how do you do observability, right? All that needs to be bought in, first of all, top-down, bottom-up. Everybody needs to buy into this principle, the cloud-native principle, and then put it in action. So there is an organizational change that's required, is the key point there. So.
Right on. Vivek,
I think the guys covered it really well. I'd summarize it from 3 points of view. And the first one is there are organizations who perhaps are not clear about the catalyst or the business premise why they should do something like cloud native. And to be fair, there's a lot of noise in the markets every time there's a new technology, etc. And if your business isn't very clear as to the reason why you want to do it, it's okay to pause You might still end up doing it, but you have to be very clear about your reason to go, because that would imply that there is enough insight about what this means for your business. The two other reasons are interesting in my opinion, and I think the guys have already touched upon them. One is intrinsic, which is to do with, as an organization, both from a culture and a capability perspective, are you aware and do you know what it's going to take to go down this path? Because this is not just buying a piece of software or a widget and switching it on. It does require a shift of processes, mindsets, skill sets. So that's the intrinsic reason. But there's an external reason, which does have a direct bearing on whether cloud native is for you or not, which is the technology stack that you're dependent on is usually made up of multiple vendors from a variety of different domains in your technology, whether you're a network provider or you're a car manufacturer. And if your vendor ecosystem is not ready to support most of your workloads in a cloud native fashion, at least in alignment with you from a roadmap point of view, well, then it's a halfway house. You could be ready, you might have the culture and the skill set and the business premise to do it. But unless you're willing to then change your vendor ecosystem, if your network functions or your IT workloads aren't going to be compatible, you're not really going to be able to exploit the full advantage of that. So I think those three are the main facets which drive the differentiation between is cloud native for everybody or it's not for a few people. And I think what I'm hearing is those kind of three reasons.
I think that's spot on, right? The conversation's when, not if. And more often than not, the de facto position is let's migrate to the cloud, let's move to cloud native, and give me a reason why not. And that's changed in the last 3 or 4 years, right? It's the really why not mentality, and starting with we're moving to the cloud as a de facto understanding for the entire business is a good change.
Yeah, and I believe there's one technology that's really aiding this progress, and that's AI, ML technology. And are you seeing embedded use cases on the edge that are quite simply driving demand for more cloud-native infrastructure, for capabilities like performance, self-replication, and scale? And Rob, I bet this is something that you're seeing a lot of.
Sure. Where we are seeing from a Ribbon perspective, AI ML applications is in multiple areas. One is in automation that I talked about before. So as we move into the cloud native architecture, the scale is much bigger, as I said before. Where there used to be hundreds of devices, now there are thousands of containers, right? The scale is big, not complex, but big. So you need to manage that network in a much better way. And AI and ML apps let us do that by focusing on the network, the traffic, and the data that's passing through, and providing the insights into what's going on, right? From an operational perspective, troubleshooting perspective, AI and ML can be used to better manage these large-scale networks. That's one. There are other use cases where, if you just look at the telco network for a bit here, there is fraud and robocalls that's happening in a big way. As you all heard, I mean, we get our phones every day, there are spam calls every day, and you think should you pick up or not, right? So AI and ML apps are also kind of helping with that in terms of looking at the characteristics of calls, the callers, the intent of the callers, the signatures of the voice and data packets, right? And they're doing this in a much faster real-time basis to let us know if a call or a data is from a good source or a bad source. And then can we notify that to the end customer? Eventually this is about end customers, independent of the public cloud infrastructure, independent of carriers and enterprises. This is the end customer that we're trying to serve. So can we provide the notification to end customers about the data or the voice aspect? Is it from a valid source or not, so that they can make the right decision? So there again, AI and ML apps are really helping to do this in a more real-time fashion.
Yeah, and I'll add to that as well. I know you mentioned Edge. I'll get to Edge in a second.
Sure.
I think what we're actually seeing is that most AI is happening in a more centralized fashion today, right? We see it fairly extensively on the conversational AI side, and the call centers is a big example, right? So how can we improve the efficiency and accuracy and response times and reduce call times for agents within a call center? That's a big area of focus for us from a conversational AI perspective, right? We talk about what's happening with generative AI as well. We're starting to see the appearances of use cases around machine vision and digital twinning, which may have implications for the edge. Large language models are likely to have implications for edge computing. But I think we're really at the forefront of this. And I think we've probably been talking at this event and events like this for years about edge computing.
Right.
What are the use cases? What are the catalysts to really see edge computing come to light? Aside from running network functions, I still think we're still really, really early in terms of defining the edge enterprise use cases. But AI will definitely be a driver. Machine vision is there. These things will come.
I think in our experience, there's two use cases which are accelerating the growth of AI-led capabilities on the edge. One, no surprise, is ORAN, and the ability to then start building and deploying mobile networks for 5G and beyond using commodity hardware and doing it in a very software-centric fashion. Now, the AI part there is about efficiency, power savings, increasing spectral efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. And more use cases will start emerging as we start seeing maturity from the data being collected at the edge from an operational command and control perspective. But then there's other more enterprise-centric use cases. For example, we're seeing a fairly interesting uptick in demand for use cases where there's a lot of video being created at the edge, and you need some sort of quick decision making to be done in near real time. For example, you have, and I think this is already operational in many parts of the world, you've got airports where you can walk through without even taking your passport out, because they're doing high definition facial recognition for hundreds of thousands of passengers. And if you're approved, the gates open and you go through. Now, you don't want that video capture being sent back to a data center 800 kilometers and then have a response being sent back, because it's going to be chaos. And that's one example. And then when you come to self-driving cars with the low latency around 5G, that's another edge. Each of those cars is an edge now. And they have a real life and death decision to make. So a lot of that data is getting generated, and those models are getting mature over time as well. So I think some of those use cases are different abstractions of edge as we typically look at it from a network, and they're going to start driving a little bit of the acceleration for edge. So hopefully it'll happen a little bit sooner than we have seen it in the past, but I'm quite confident this is just the beginning.
Yeah, and I think those are outstanding examples, and I think this really does set it up for a wrap-up takeaway question, which is offering the use cases where the businesses that design and build these applications, and they're underpinned by the applications by cloud-native principles. And Vivek, are you seeing more uptake for cloud-native principles and driving, this application development?
Definitely. I mean, the case in point I prove to prove that point is look at the vendor ecosystem, right? Even some of the biggest legacy organizations who challenged the notion of cloud-native a few years ago are now saying, well, we're cloud-native, and they're moving their product roadmap. And it's not just in telecoms. You're seeing this shift across pretty much every industry. I would go as far as saying I think cloud native is at the tipping point cloud was about 8 years ago in terms of adoption. Kevin made a really interesting point where he said the conversation has changed from why do I want to do it to how do I start doing this? Yes. That shift's already happened, and this isn't in isolation. A business wouldn't have the confidence to have that conversation if they didn't have a little bit of understanding and appreciation that the ecosystem that they depend on is also starting to move forward. So yes, we're seeing the whole industry move forward. There's obviously different maturity levels in either geographies or industries where the uptake is higher or lower, but it is the future. It's where it's headed.
I believe it.
I would add to that, right? I think there's a virtuous cycle happening. Absolutely, do I think that cloud-native principles are pushing the application ecosystem to rethink how they build applications, their tooling, their operating models. I also am now starting to see the reverse happen, which is the application ecosystem pulling the cloud-native ecosystem even faster to a set of capabilities that they've always believed intuitively telecom needed different sets of capabilities. High packet processing was a conversation several years ago. I think we're starting to see this happen now where the application ecosystem is contributing back into the cloud-native ecosystem in a very positive and productive way. And I don't think maybe 3 or 4 years ago that was happening as much, right? It was really, really the push, and now we're starting to see the pull in the other direction as well. So that virtuous cycle, I think, across the entire vendor ecosystem is beneficial, and I think it's starting to give the confidence to all telecoms that this is not only possible, but it's here, it's now.
Right on. Rob.
No, I agree with what Kevin and Vivek said there. In the past 18 months or so, we have seen a lot of interest in cloud-native architectures, both from the carrier perspective and enterprise perspective, the Fortune 500 from enterprise perspective. And what's driving is the need to do launch services quickly. That's obviously number one. But also some of the hidden things are, how do I become compliant with security and stay compliant with security, right? How do I become compliant with regulatory mandates and stay compliant, right? And that needs the agility that cloud-native architectures provide. So those are some of the driving factors behind this. And again, it's going to be a phased process in the next 18 to 36 months. But organizations are starting to look at that, retool their infrastructure, both from a people perspective and from a toolkit perspective, but things are happening now compared to like 5 years ago, but things are starting to happen. But I think it'll really be about 18 to 36 months when we'll see the real groundswell towards cloud-native architectures.
And on that high note, I'd like to thank our distinguished panel for joining us here in Barcelona, and good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.